On the night of August 11th, a United States warship fired Hellfire missiles at a Panama-flagged vessel moving through the Gulf of Oman toward an Iranian port. That single strike, confirmed by the U.S. military and reported by CNN in the early hours of August 12th, was not an isolated event. It was the latest flashpoint in a war that is now stretched across more than 5 months. A war that began with a single night of coordinated strikes and has since dragged 3 American aircraft carriers, tens of thousands of troops, and nearly every navy in the region into the waters around the Strait of Hormuz. And as of this week, something massive has entered the Gulf. Not just ships, but a shift in the balance of power that Iran itself may have triggered through its own miscalculations. To understand what is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That was the night the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of airstrikes against Iran, hitting military command centers, nuclear-linked facilities, and government targets. According to Wikipedia's continuously updated summary of the conflict, corroborated by contemporaneous wire reporting, the strikes killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with a string of senior military officials, in what is now documented separately as the assassination of Ali Khamenei. The strikes came in the middle of active negotiations between Washington and Tehran over Iran's nuclear program, negotiations that had been running since late 2025. The timing was deliberate. The talks collapsed instantly, and Iran's response was immediate. Missile and drone attacks on Israel, on American bases, and on U.S. allied nations across the region, followed by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and petroleum products pass every single day, according to figures from the U.S. Energy Information Administration cited by Stars and Stripes. That closure of the Strait of Hormuz was the first sign that this war would not stay contained to Iranian and Israeli airspace. It would become a Gulf-wide crisis, dragging in Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, whether they wanted to be involved or not. Within days, Iran began retaliating against American and allied positions scattered across the Gulf states. On February 28th, and in the days that followed, according to documentation on the 2026 Iranian strikes on Kuwait, Iranian forces launched a series of missiles and drones at American and Kuwaiti targets inside Kuwait. A missile attack near the civilian port of Shuaiba killed 6 U.S. soldiers and wounded dozens more, with 38 hospitalized, according to CNN's reporting cited in that record. 2 Kuwaiti Navy servicemen were killed in the line of duty, Kuwaiti officials confirmed. But in the chaos of that engagement, something happened that Iran could never have planned for, and that, in hindsight, became one of the starkest examples of how this war has gone wrong for Tehran, in ways beyond just the battlefield. An F-A-18 of the Kuwait Air Force shot down 3 American F-15E fighter jets in a friendly fire incident. The American crews survived, but the incident revealed just how chaotic and dangerous the skies over the Gulf had become. Chaos that Iran's missile barrage had triggered, but that ended up costing the United States, not Iran, in a moment of pure military confusion. Qatar was hit too. Since the war began, missile strikes have repeatedly targeted the small but wealthy Gulf state, according to the Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Iranian strikes on Qatar. Doha's airspace was shut down on the very first day of the strikes, disrupting flights out of Hamad International Airport. One of the most economically damaging strikes hit a Qatari liquefied natural gas facility at Ras Laffan, cutting the country's LNG export capacity by nearly 17% for an estimated 3 to 5 years. That detail matters enormously because Qatar was, among all the Gulf Arab states, the one country that had maintained a genuinely workable relationship with Iran for decades. The two nations share the South Pars North Dome gas field, the largest gas field on the planet, a field that provides roughly 80% of Qatar's government revenue. By striking the one Gulf neighbor that had tried to stay diplomatically close to Tehran, Iran didn't just damage infrastructure, it damaged one of its only remaining regional relationships. That is the first thread of how Iran's strikes backfired. They didn't just hit adversaries, they hit the one partner Tehran could least afford to alienate. Saudi Arabia was struck as well, prompting Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan to jointly warn that continued Iranian attacks on Gulf states could trigger a wider regional escalation, according to the Wikipedia record on the 2026 Iranian strikes on Saudi Arabia. On March 21st, Saudi Arabia expelled Iranian defense officials, giving them just 24 hours to leave the country. Pakistan's foreign minister invoked a mutual defense agreement signed with Saudi Arabia back in September 2025, and after a ceasefire was later reached, Pakistan sent 13,000 troops and fighter jets to reinforce Saudi Arabia. Think about that for a moment. Iran's campaign to punish Gulf states for hosting American forces ended up doing the opposite of what Tehran intended. Instead of pressuring these countries to distance themselves from Washington, the strikes pushed Saudi Arabia into inviting thousands of additional foreign troops onto its soil and pushed Gulf capitals into tighter security coordination with each other and with the United States. Meanwhile, the naval buildup that forms the something massive entering the Gulf right now has been building for months in stages, each one bigger than the last. In the earliest days of the crisis, back in January 2026, before the shooting even started, Al Jazeera reported that President Trump described a massive fleet, an armada, heading toward the Gulf as tensions built. Analysts at the Middle East Forum documented something unusual at that time: a 20-day gap with 0 American aircraft carriers present in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, the first such gap since October 2023, which some analysts called a psychological anomaly, occurring at precisely the moment tensions were spiking. That gap didn't last. The USS Abraham Lincoln, according to B&E and Telenews reporting from January, transited the Malacca Strait and moved into the Andaman Sea en route to the Gulf, at one point disabling its own tracking transponder after exiting major shipping lanes, a signal, experts said, that operational secrecy was becoming a priority. By February, a second carrier joined the buildup. The New York Times confirmed on February 13th that the USS Gerald R. Ford would be redeployed from operations near Venezuela to the Middle East, becoming the second American carrier assigned to the region, according to Army Recognition's defense reporting. This was, at the time, described as the first dual-carrier presence in the CENTCOM area of responsibility in nearly a year. The Ford transited the Strait of Gibraltar on February 20th, according to USNI News, crossed the Mediterranean, made a port call at Ceuta Bay in Crete, a strategic NATO hub roughly 2,350 kilometers from the Middle East, and by early March had transited the Suez Canal, entering the Red Sea as part of what the U.S. military designated Operation Epic Fury, according to Stars and Stripes reporting from March 7th. Then came the third carrier. By March 9th, according to reporting on the buildup after Iran's strikes on Saudi Arabia, the Pentagon was preparing to send the USS George H.W. Bush across the Atlantic to join the Lincoln and the Ford, creating what was described as the largest concentration of American naval firepower in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. At that point, more than 30 Iranian vessels had reportedly been destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz remained shut, and Saudi Arabia was absorbing near-daily missile and drone attacks on its oil infrastructure. It was also around this moment that Iran made a claim that would become one of the clearest examples of its strikes backfiring, not militarily, but in the far more damaging arena of information warfare. On March 5th, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps announced it had struck the USS Abraham Lincoln with ballistic missiles and drones. U.S. Central Command flatly denied it, stating the missiles didn't come close, and released photographs showing the carrier operating normally with no visible damage. Independent fact-checkers at PolitiFact examined the viral videos that Iranian state media and supporters circulated to support the claim, and found them to be fabricated or misidentified. For a regime trying to project strength and rally domestic morale during an existential war, being caught fabricating a major battlefield claim, one debunked publicly by independent fact-checkers within days, was a significant self-inflicted wound. It handed the United States a propaganda victory it did not even have to fight for. By April, the war had ground into something resembling exhaustion on both sides, and on April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a ceasefire, mediated by Pakistan, according to the Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Iran war ceasefire. It came only after Iran had rejected an earlier 45-day two-phased ceasefire framework that Pakistan introduced on April 5th, instead pushing its own 10-point peace proposal. What finally forced the issue, according to that same record, was a blunt warning from President Trump on April 7th that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not agree to end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Hours later, the 2-week ceasefire was announced. It was fragile from the start. Both sides were accused of violating it almost immediately. On April 21st, the day before the ceasefire was due to expire, Trump said he expected to be bombing again if negotiators failed to reach a deal, but hours later he extended the ceasefire instead. That reprieve did not hold. By mid-May, tensions were rising again. On May 17th, Trump warned, in his own words, that for Iran the clock is ticking and they better get moving fast, or there won't be anything left of them. The very next day, he said he would hold off on any new attack plan, citing a direct request from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, 3 Gulf states that, despite having been battered by Iranian strikes months earlier, were now actively working to prevent a fresh escalation because further war in the Gulf threatened their own economies and security just as much as it threatened Iran's. The ceasefire eventually collapsed for good. According to CNN's live reporting from August 4th, the U.S. naval blockade against Iran, first announced on April 13th, was reimposed after the collapse of a ceasefire that had been tied to a broader memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran. Central Command reported that under the reimposed blockade, it had redirected 44 commercial vessels, disabled 2 and boarded 2 more, all in a single reporting window. Mohsen Rezai, a military advisor to Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, said on Iranian state television that Iran's armed forces would not stand idly by and would under no circumstances allow any route through the Strait of Hormuz other than what he called Iran's route. That single phrase captures the entire strategic dispute now playing out in the Gulf. Iran insists it retains sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz, while the United States and its allies insist on freedom of navigation through what is legally an international strait bordered by both Iran and Oman. The human and economic toll along the way has been severe and is worth stating plainly, because it is verified by multiple named sources rather than rumor. According to CNN's reporting in early August, U.S. strikes in July damaged a desalination plant in Iran's southern Hormozgan province, leaving 20 villages without water, according to that province's deputy governor. That strike, CNN reported, came after Kuwait accused Iran of attacking one of its own water facilities. Retaliation begetting retaliation, water infrastructure hit on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz, according to the ongoing Iran War Day-by-Day tracker, maintained by Global Security. Org, which compiles CENTCOM statements and cross-references them against independent reporting, the toll from Hormuz area incidents since the April 8th ceasefire stands at 14 or more confirmed civilian mariner deaths, including the loss of the vessel GFS Galaxy on July 11th or 12th, with at least one additional seafarer still unaccounted for as of the August 7th update, the third engineer of a vessel called the Minoan Pioneer, whose salvage operation was still ongoing. That same tracker documented that CENTCOM's official injury count stood at approximately 290 U.S. service members hurt across the full campaign, with more than 255 already returned to duty. Now, to the most recent developments, the ones that explain why something massive entering the Gulf is not just a dramatic phrase, but a literal description of what has been happening this month. According to Al Jazeera's live coverage from August 2nd, Iran's Major General Ali Abdullahi issued a fresh warning to Gulf states hosting American military bases, saying nations cooperating with the United States will burn in the fires of war. That same reporting period saw Kuwait's armed forces intercept drone threats over its own airspace. A tanker struck by an unidentified projectile near the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz off the coast of Oman, reported by the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, and a merchant vessel requiring an armed escort from the Italian frigate Bergamini just to safely transit the Red Sea under the European Union's Aspides naval mission. This is what a contested, only partially open Strait of Hormuz looks like in practice. Every single transit now requires monitoring, escort, or armed protection, months after the war supposedly first paused. Then, on August 6th, Reuters and the Japan Times both reported, citing 5 separate sources, that Iran had made what one outlet called a concerted diplomatic push toward Gulf states, warning them explicitly that Tehran would strike their oil, power, and water plants unless they persuaded President Trump to halt U.S. strikes and instead pursue a negotiated end to the war. This was a remarkable admission, in effect, of just how much pressure Iran was under. Rather than issuing threats from a position of strength, Iran was now trying to use its Gulf neighbors as intermediaries and leverage points to pressure Washington, a sign that direct military deterrence against the United States and Israel had not worked as intended, and that Tehran was reaching for indirect tools instead. On August 5th, CNN reported that Yemen's Houthi movement claimed to have struck a Saudi oil tanker named Daisy in the Gulf of Aden with a ballistic missile, saying the strike forced the vessel to change course and turn back, part of what the group called a siege-for-siege blockade against Saudi Arabia. CNN noted explicitly that the claim could not be independently verified, an important distinction to draw, because not every reported strike in this conflict has been confirmed by neutral sources, and honest reporting has to say so rather than presenting contested claims as settled fact. That same CNN report noted that marine traffic ship tracking data showed at least 10 commercial vessels had passed through the Strait of Hormuz in the preceding 24 hours, even amid ongoing talks about fully reopening the waterway. Evidence that the strait, while far from normal, has not been completely and permanently sealed. By August 11th, according to CNN's rolling coverage, the situation had both hardened and, in some ways, become more dangerous for ordinary shipping. The United States and Iran were reported to be demanding compensation from each other as a precondition for any renewed talks, each side insisting the other pay first, an impasse that itself illustrates how far apart the two governments remain. Yemen accused Iran-backed Houthi forces of killing 6 people in what was described as a double-tap strike, a first strike followed by a second, deliberately timed to hit responders, on a commercial vessel in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. The UK's Maritime Monitoring Authority reported a separate incident involving a container ship and military forces in the Gulf of Oman. And in the most direct escalation of the week, the US military confirmed it had fired Hellfire missiles at a Panama-flagged vessel that was sailing toward an Iranian port, enforcing the terms of the reimposed blockade with lethal force against a ship simply for its destination. U.S. officials warned, according to that same reporting, that the continued shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz could push oil and gas prices even higher worldwide. And global oil prices did in fact rise that day as Washington and Tehran each set increasingly rigid conditions for reopening the waterway. There was also a significant internal development inside Iran's own military leadership. According to CNN's August 11th coverage, Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who assumed the role after his predecessor was killed in the opening strikes back in February, and who Al Jazeera reported was himself wounded during the conflict, announced 6 senior military appointments, reshaping the country's command structure. Among the changes, Ali Abdullahi, the same general who had issued the burn in the fires of war warning days earlier, was named Armed Forces Chief of Staff. A wholesale reshuffling of top military leadership in the middle of an active, unresolved war with a hostile naval blockade sitting off your coastline is not typically a sign of confidence. It is far more often a sign of an institution under strain, adjusting because its previous command structure had failed to deliver the results the leadership wanted, whether that meant failing to break the blockade, failing to reopen the strait on Iran's terms, or simply absorbing months of continuous losses without a clear path to victory. It's worth stepping back here to look at the broader picture of what backfired actually means in this specific war, because it is not a single event. It is a pattern that repeats across nearly every major Iranian action since February. Iran struck Kuwait to punish it for hosting American forces, and the result was Kuwaiti jets accidentally shooting down American planes in the confusion, followed by Kuwait deepening its security cooperation with Washington rather than distancing from it. Iran struck Qatar's gas infrastructure, damaging the one Gulf relationship it could genuinely rely on, and cutting into a revenue stream that Qatar depends on for the vast majority of its government budget. Iran struck Saudi Arabia's oil and military infrastructure to deter Riyadh from supporting the American campaign, and the result was Saudi Arabia expelling Iranian officials and inviting 13,000 additional Pakistani troops onto its territory. Iran claimed a dramatic strike on the USS Abraham Lincoln to boost morale and project strength, and the claim was debunked within days by CENTCOM's own photographic evidence and by independent fact-checkers examining the viral footage. And now, in August, Iran is reduced to pleading with the very Gulf states it once threatened, asking them to intercede with Washington on its behalf, an approach that only underscores how much leverage Tehran has lost since the war began. None of this means the war is close to over, and it would be dishonest to suggest that Iran has been rendered powerless. Iran retains real capabilities. Reporting from Army Recognition and other defense outlets has consistently noted that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy can conduct asymmetric swarm attacks using fast, small boats, that Iran operates 3 Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines capable of ambush tactics in the shallow, congested waters of the Gulf, and that the Strait of Hormuz itself, at its narrowest point roughly 21 nautical miles wide, remains vulnerable to mining, even though a full closure would devastate Iran's own oil exports just as much as anyone else's. Iran-backed groups, including the Houthis in Yemen and elements of Hezbollah in Lebanon, remain active and capable of independent strikes that complicate any Western effort to declare the region secure. And the IRGC's so-called Persian Gulf Strait Authority, according to the Global Security. Org Tracker has reportedly been charging commercial vessels a toll of up to $2 million per ship, payable in Chinese yuan, Bitcoin, or the stablecoin USDT, just to transit waters. Iran still claims a measure of control over, a sign that Tehran is trying to convert its remaining leverage over the Strait of Hormuz into direct financial income, even under blockade. So where does that leave things as of this week? 3 American carrier strike groups have, at various points over the past several months, converged on or near the Gulf, representing what analysts have called the largest concentration of American naval power in the region since the Iraq invasion of 2003. The naval blockade against Iran, first imposed in April and reimposed after the ceasefire collapsed, remains in effect, with CENTCOM actively redirecting, disabling, and boarding vessels attempting to breach it, and now using lethal force against ships bound for Iranian ports. The Strait of Hormuz is neither fully open nor fully closed. Commercial traffic moves through it, but only under conditions of armed escort, constant monitoring, and real risk, with Lloyd's List intelligence reportedly assessing that no Western allied vessel has transited the strait without incident since early May. And Iran, rather than dictating terms from a position of strength, is now warning Gulf neighbors while simultaneously asking them to plead its case in Washington, a contradiction that speaks louder than any single missile strike about how the balance of this war has shifted. What we can say with confidence, because it comes from named, checkable sources, CENTCOM statements, Reuters, CNN, the Wikipedia documented casualty, and event records, drawing on wire services, Stars and Stripes, USNI News, Al Jazeera, the Japan Times, and independent fact-checking from PolitiFact, is that Iran's campaign to punish and pressure the Gulf states surrounding the Strait of Hormuz has repeatedly produced outcomes opposite to what Tehran intended: tighter Gulf view, cooperation, a damaged relationship with Qatar, a debunked propaganda claim about striking an American carrier, and now direct appeals to the same neighbors it once threatened. What we cannot say with full confidence is exactly how the current diplomatic standoff over compensation preconditions will resolve, whether the reported Houthi strikes on the Daisy tanker and the Bab al-Mandeb vessel will be independently verified beyond the claims of the parties involved, or what the reshuffled Iranian military command under Mojtaba Khamenei intends to do differently going forward. Those remain open, contested, and unresolved questions, and honest reporting has to leave them that way rather than filling in the gaps with speculation. The ripple effects of this war have reached far beyond the Strait of Hormuz itself, and that global dimension is part of why this story matters, even to people who have never set foot in the Gulf. According to the Wikipedia record documenting the economic impact of the 2026 Iran war, the closure of the strait sent immediate shockwaves through global energy markets in the days after February 28th, given that roughly a fifth of the world's oil and petroleum products normally pass through that 21 nautical mile choke point every day. Airlines around the world were forced to reroute or cancel flights through Middle Eastern airspace entirely, a disruption that Al Jazeera's reporting from late January had already flagged as a risk even before the shooting started, when international carriers began canceling routes through the region in anticipation of exactly this kind of escalation. Insurance premiums for commercial shipping transiting anywhere near the Gulf of Oman or the Strait of Hormuz spiked, and that cost has been passed down the supply chain ever since, embedded in the price of everything from gasoline to shipping container rates on routes that have nothing directly to do with the Middle East. The human displacement tied to this war has also been substantial and well documented. According to the Wikipedia entry on evacuations during the 2026 Iran war, the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes that opened the conflict on February 28th triggered a wave of evacuations across Iran and the wider Middle East, involving civilians, foreign nationals, military personnel, and diplomatic staff. Airspace closures across multiple countries, not just Qatar, disrupted travel broadly, and the disruption combined with active fighting left hundreds of thousands of people stranded at various points, requiring organized repatriation efforts by multiple governments. On the American side, the Middle East Forum's analysis noted that a partial evacuation of U.S. personnel was ordered as early as January 14th, with hundreds relocated to other facilities and to local hotels in the Gulf region, and 6 KC-135 aerial refueling tankers departing under cover of night as the buildup accelerated, all before a single shot had officially been fired. The war also triggered protest movements far outside the Middle East, and the record of those protests, again according to Wikipedia's documentation, shows just how widely this conflict has been felt. Demonstrations, some of which turned violent, broke out worldwide, beginning on February 28th, the day the strikes began, and continued for months afterward. In Pakistan, protests connected to the war resulted in between 26 and 35 deaths and more than 120 injuries, according to that tracking. Kenya recorded 4 deaths and more than 30 injuries linked to related unrest. Comoros saw 1 death and 5 injuries. In the Philippines, 7 police officers were injured during demonstrations tied to the conflict. These numbers matter because they illustrate that the war over the Strait of Hormuz has never been a contained regional dispute. It has functioned as a flashpoint for political anger and instability on multiple continents, well beyond the Gulf states directly involved in the fighting. Diplomatically, Pakistan's role deserves particular attention because it has functioned as the primary mediator throughout nearly the entire conflict, a fact confirmed across multiple sources including the ceasefire documentation and the Global Security Org Tracker. It was Pakistan that brokered the April 8th ceasefire, Pakistan that proposed the initial 45-day 2-phase framework that Iran rejected in favor of its own 10-point plan, and Pakistan that continued hosting talks in Islamabad even after the ceasefire began fraying. The Global Security Org Day-by-Day Tracker also notes an emerging secondary mediation track involving Beijing, suggesting that China has been positioning itself as an alternative or supplementary channel for negotiations, separate from the Pakistan-led process, though the specifics and success of that Beijing track remain far less documented and far more uncertain than the Pakistani effort. It's also worth noting how the timeline of major turning points lines up, because the pattern of escalation and de-escalation has followed a fairly consistent rhythm since April. The Global Security Org campaign tracker lays out the sequence clearly. The initial February 28th strike that opened the war, a 40-day active combat phase that ended with the April 8th Pakistan-brokered ceasefire, the April 13th announcement of the naval blockade and its ongoing enforcement, a brief and specifically named Project Freedom convoy operation on May 4th that reportedly paused within 24 hours of starting, and the May 5th formal declaration that the American bombing campaign, designated Operation Epic Fury, was complete. What followed after that was described as a post-ceasefire diplomatic phase, one that has clearly proven far more fragile than its name suggests, given that the blockade was reimposed and lethal enforcement actions, including this week's Hellfire missile strike on a Panama-flagged vessel, have continued well into August. As of the most recent CENTCOM-linked reporting from early August, President Trump himself was quoted telling reporters on August 7th that the war's got to end pretty soon, adding that he did not believe Iran can go much longer. A public assessment from the American side that Iran's capacity to sustain the conflict is nearing its limit. That same reporting window referenced a Bloomberg account suggesting internal deliberations about how to bring the conflict to a close, even as, just days earlier, the Wall Street Journal had reported that Trump ordered a new multi-day wave of strikes aimed at forcing what was described internally as Iran's surrender, with CBS separately reporting joint U.S. Israeli planning specifically targeting Iranian energy infrastructure. Whether that planned wave of strikes was fully carried out, scaled back, or shelved in favor of the current blockade and negotiate approach is not entirely clear from the available reporting, and it's important to be upfront about that uncertainty rather than presenting a single, tidy narrative when the underlying sources themselves describe a fluid and inconsistent American strategy over the past 2 weeks. Before closing, it's worth being explicit about where this account draws its facts from, because transparency about sourcing matters as much as the facts themselves. The historical framework of the war, its casualty figures for Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and the details of the ceasefire came from Wikipedia's actively updated and heavily cited entries on the 2026 Iran War, the 2026 Iran War ceasefire, and the individual country strike pages, which themselves compile CENTCOM statements and wire service reporting from outlets, including Reuters and CNN. The day-by-day operational detail, including the reimposed blockade figures, the toll system charging vessels in Yuan, Bitcoin, and USDT, and the ongoing casualty accounting dispute over which deaths count under the official Iran war category, came from Global Security, Org's continuously updated military tracker. The naval buildup timeline, carrier by carrier, came from a combination of stars and stripes, USNI News, Army Recognition, The National Interest, the National Security Journal, and Gulf News, all of which independently confirmed the movements of the USS Abraham Lincoln, USS Gerald R. Ford, and USS George H.W. Bush. The most recent developments from early and mid-August, including the Hellfire strike on the Panama-flagged vessel, the Houthi claims regarding the Daisy tanker and the Bab al-Mandeb strike, the compensation standoff, and the reshuffling of Iran's military command under Mojtaba Khamenei, came directly from CNN's rolling live coverage and Al Jazeera's parallel live reporting from August 1st through August 12th. Several things remain genuinely unverified and should be treated that way rather than repeated as settled fact. The Houthi claim of striking the Saudi tanker Daisy has not been independently confirmed beyond the group's own statement, as CNN itself noted. The precise extent of Chinese involvement in a secondary mediation track alongside Pakistan's established role remains thinly sourced. In the internal American debate over whether a new multi-day strike campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure was fully executed, partially executed, or shelved entirely in early August is described inconsistently across the Wall Street Journal, CBS, and Bloomberg accounts referenced in the Global Security Org Tracker, and deserves continued scrutiny rather than a confident conclusion either way. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Iran built its entire strategy around the idea that striking Gulf neighbors and threatening escalation would force the United States to back down and would rally the region against Washington. 5.5 months in, with 3 carrier strike groups having passed through or remained on station near the Gulf, with a blockade still enforced by lethal force, and with Tehran now asking the same countries it once threatened to intervene on its behalf, has that strategy actually worked, or has it done the opposite of what Iran intended? Let us know what you think happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, and whether you think this war is closer to a real resolution or closer to another collapse of the ceasefire that keeps almost holding and then falling apart. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this story as it develops.